Welcome to the Archive of Nations, whom are the custodians of the sacred records from time immemorial. Please subscribe and press the notification button, as we have many lessons to educate and empower with a correct narrative of the past to create a lawful blueprint for the future. Welcome to webisode 18, entitled Carbon Organic Hebrew Are the True Founders of Western Civilization Part 1, Kushite Hindu Origins of the East. As we continue on from our previous webisode, this is Sparta, Carbon Organic Sparta. We will briefly explore the background of what is referred to as the Israelite Hebrews of carbon organic extraction and their origins as the progenitors of the Peloponnese, carrying with them their gods and cultures. We will explore their constant intermixing, which created a multitude of cultural influences, which have impacted the globe in the form of the religions of the West. Many from an Afrocentric Pan-African-centered thought dismiss them as not factually existing due to their records being founded in the Bible, and the Bible is considered a fictional tool of the white man. And then there are others who claim to descend from the Israelites and trace the records of the biblical tribes to real-world peoples and events who have been dispersed across the globe from West Africa to Britain, Tibet to Timbuktu. The records of these peoples have impacted the world and set the foundation for what is referred to as Western civilization, as this series intends to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt. In previous webisodes, we have alluded to the Israelite influence on Western civilization, especially in the realms of law and religion, which we intend to study much further, especially around the lawful solution of nation building once we have figured out how we got here as mislabeled bond slaves. Within these lessons in regard to ancient Greece and Rome, we have shown without a shadow of a doubt that the ancient Greeks, known as Pelasgians, were an amalgamation of ancient carbon organic African tribes, families, and clans from the east referred to as Asiatics, who were an admixture within themselves of ancient African, Indus Valley, and Australoid tribes, families, and clans, which this webisode will focus upon. We must begin to understand the distinction between what is referred to as Egypt, or biblically Mitzrayim, founded by Narmer, and pre-dynastic Kemet, or Africa, also known as the biblical Kamites or Hamites, which predate Narmer and Eastern influence. We must realize that they are different yet related peoples and cultures from time immemorial. What is referred to as the Egyptian dynastic period is the point of fusion between these tribes, families, and clans, their cultures, and their expression of divinity represented as various gods and goddesses. The Hellenes, in their myths of trying to discover their origins, only had the records from the carbon organic presence in the region explaining the ancient origins of the Pelasgians, and their records of creation represented as the primordial gods, Titans, and Olympiads, of which we have discussed thus far in the series, clearly proving their origins from the carbon organic continents of Africa and Asia, which is really part of one land mass. It was in the region of Lower Egypt, which includes the Levant, where this fusion of cultures took place, which was then transported to the Peloponnese Peninsula, the land of the dark faces. To better understand the fusion of carbon organic pre-dynastic Africa and carbon organic Asia, creating what we now refer to as Egyptian civilization, we must begin with Narmer, whom is also known as Baal, Menes, and Minos, and is the one accredited for uniting Upper and Lower Egypt and founding the 46 dynasties, which is really a representation of the fusion of genetic families, as in 46 chromosomes. Before we begin with Narmer, we are going to go back 1,000 years to the origins of Hercules, the deity of which the ancient carbon organic Pelasgians, Danans, Cadmonites, Dorians, Spartans, and Macedonians, all of which trace their genetic lines of inheritance, divine kingship, and right to rule, and we will also explore the lasting impact that Hercules had on the institution of kingship in ancient Egypt. It must be clear that we recognize ancient Egypt, Arabia, and the Indus Valley as part of one greater empire, whom share the same stories, cultures, and rites, and have gods and heroes under different names representing the same people. The question for many is which came first, which is not our point of exploration in this video, but will be undertaken when we return to the histories of Asia, India, and Africa, which were all populated by carbon organic, woolly-haired peoples. Greek historians such as Arrian and Diodorus Siculus, who were quoting from the still earlier works of Megasthenes, have represented Hercules as a native of India, who was depicted amongst the Indians with his club and lion's hide, and was worshipped by the Surasena tribe at the city of Mathura, on the banks of the Yamuna River. It must be understood, and we have to keep making this clear, the ancient inhabitants of the Indus River Valley were carbon organic tribes, families, and clans. It must also be clear that his story has tried to tie carbon organic people to what is referred to as Africa today only, and have recently began to narrow the carbon organic tribes, families, and clans to only the sub-Saharan region of Africa. As mentioned in previous webisodes, and we will clarify in greater detail in further webisodes, this is a form of administrative word magic being conducted to steal the land and resources of the world. The whole globe was carbon organic dominant, so it's important we get out of our emotions and feelings and study and accept the confirmed realities of the true origins of humanity and its varying interrelated cultures. We have a whole series coming up on the Indus Valley region and ancient Arabia, so we will not spend too much time clarifying the carbon organic presence in the region and how it originally came about. Here, though, we will present just enough to see the influences that migrated into Europe from the eastern and southern continents. Let us begin with a brief history of the Kingdom of Kush, which predates Egypt, culturally also known as the Kushite Empire, or simply Kush, which was an ancient kingdom in Nubia, centered along the Nile Valley in what is now northern Sudan and southern Egypt. The region of Nubia was an early cradle of civilization, producing several complex societies that engaged in trade and industry. The city-state of Kerma emerged as the dominant political force between 2450 and 1450 BC, controlling the Nile Valley between the First and Fourth Cataracts, an area as large as Egypt. The Egyptians were the first to identify Kerma as Kush, and over the next several centuries the two civilizations engaged in intermittent warfare, trade, and cultural exchange. Much of Nubia came under Egyptian rule during the New Kingdom period, 1550 to 1070 BC. Following Egypt's disintegration amid the Late Bronze Age collapse, the Kushites re-established a kingdom in Napata, now modern Karima, Sudan. Though Kush had developed many cultural affinities with Egypt, both venerated Amun, the royal families of both kingdoms occasionally intermarried. Kushite culture, language, and ethnicity was distinct. Egyptian art distinguished the people of Kush by their dress, appearance, and even method of transportation. In the 8th century BC, King Kashta the Kushite peacefully became king of Upper Egypt, while his daughter, Amenertis, was appointed as divine adoratress of Amun in Thebes. His successor Pi invaded Lower Egypt, establishing the Kushite-ruled 25th dynasty. Pi's daughter, Shepenupet II, was also appointed divine adoratress of Amun. The monarchs of Kush ruled Egypt for over a century until the Assyrian conquest, finally being expelled by the Assyrian kings Esarhaddon and Ashurbanipal in the mid-7th century BC. Following the severing of ties with Egypt, the Kushite imperial capital was located at Meroe, during which time the Greeks knew it as Ethiopia. Geographically, Kush referred to the region south of the First Cataract in general. Kush also was the home of the rulers of the 25th dynasty, which play an important part in the foundation of the ancient Peloponnese. The name Kush, since at least the time of Josephus, has been connected with the biblical character Cush in the Hebrew Bible, son of Ham, Genesis 10 verse 6. Ham had 4 sons named Cush, Put, Canaan, and Mizraim, the Hebrew name for Egypt. According to the Bible, Nimrod, a son of Cush, was the founder and king of Babylon, Erech, Akkad, and Calneh, and Shinar according to Gen 10:10. We will begin by exploring the Kushites and their migrations. Kushites entered India in primitive ages, and there found Aboriginal Malays. They did not exterminate them, but conciliated, civilized, and to some extent absorbed them. This was the Ethiopian custom over their wide domains. The Malay are also known as Malayu Asli, Aboriginal Malays, or Malayu Purba, Ancient Malays. The Proto-Malays are of Austronesian origin and thought to have migrated to the Malay archipelago in a long series of migrations between 2500 and 1500 BC. The Malays are an Austronesian ethno-religious group native to eastern Sumatra, the Malay Peninsula, and coastal Borneo, as well as the smaller islands that lie between these locations. These locations are today part of the countries of Malaysia and Indonesia. There is considerable linguistic, cultural, artistic, and social diversity among the many Malay subgroups, mainly due to hundreds of years of immigration and assimilation of various regional ethnicity and tribes within maritime Southeast Asia. Historically, the Malay population is descended primarily from the earlier Malayic-speaking Austronesians and Austroasiatic tribes who founded several ancient maritime trading states and kingdoms. The concept of a Malay race was originally proposed by the German physician Johann Friedrich Blumenbach, 1752 to 1840, and classified as a brown race. Malay is a loose term used in the late 19th century and early 20th century to describe the Austronesian peoples. Since Blumenbach, many anthropologists have rejected his theory of 5 races, citing the enormous complexity of classifying races. In his 1775 doctoral dissertation titled De Generis Humani Varietate Nativa, translated as On the Natural Varieties of Mankind, Blumenbach outlined Johann Friedrich Blumenbach's main human races by skin color, geography, and skull measurements, namely Caucasians, white, Ethiopians, black, Americans, red, and the Mongolians, yellow. Blumenbach added Austronesians as the 5th category to his varieties of humans in the 2nd edition of De Generis, 1781. He initially grouped them by geography and thus called Austronesians the people from the southern world. In the 3rd edition, published in 1795, he named Austronesians the Malay race or the brown race, after studies done by Joseph Banks, who was part of the first voyage of James Cook. Blumenbach's definition of the Malay race is largely identical to the modern distribution of the Austronesian peoples, including not only islanders Southeast Asians, but also the people of Madagascar and the Pacific Islands. Although Blumenbach's work was later used in scientific racism, Blumenbach was a monogynist and did not believe the human varieties were inherently inferior to each other. However, he believed in the degenerative hypothesis and believed that the Malay race were a transitory form between Caucasians and Ethiopians. The Malay variety consisted of tawny-colored, hair black, soft, curly, thick and plentiful, head moderately narrowed, forehead slightly swelling, nose full, rather wide, as it were diffuse, end thick, mouth large, upper jaw somewhat prominent with parts of the face when seen in profile, sufficiently prominent and distinct from each other. Johann Friedrich Blumenbach, The Anthropological Treatises of Johann Friedrich Blumenbach, translated by Thomas Bendish, 1865. By the 19th century, however, scientific racism was favoring a classification of Austronesians as being a subset of the Mongolian race, as well as polygenism. The Australo-Melanesian populations of Southeast Asia and Melanesia, whom Blumenbach initially classified as a subrace of the Malay race, were also now being treated as a separate Ethiopian race by authors like Georges Cuvier, Conrad Maltebrun, Julian Joseph Viery, and René Lesson. The British naturalist James Cowles Pritchard originally followed Blumenbach by treating Papuans and native Australians as being descendants of the same stock as Austronesians. But by his 3rd edition of Researches into the Physical History of Man, 1836 to 1847, his work had become more racialized due to the influence of polygenism. Despite this, he acknowledges that Malayo-Polynesians and Pelasgian Negroes had remarkable characters in common, particularly in terms of language and craniometry. In the course of history, the term Malay has been extended to other non-carbon organic ethnic groups within the Malay world. This usage is nowadays largely confined to Malaysia and Singapore, where descendants of immigrants from these ethnic groups are termed as anak dagang traders and who are predominantly from the Indonesian archipelago such as the Acehnese, Banjarese, Bugis, Mandailing, Minangkabau, and Javanese. In the central provinces, an Aboriginal Malay race forms a large proportion of the population, showing that the ancient carbon organic Kushites may have refused to intermix. The Kushites who migrated and settled in the Indus River Valley region became known as Dravidian peoples. The Dravidian speakers, or Dravidians, are a linguistic and cultural group living primarily in southern Asia and speaking any of the Dravidian languages. Proto-Dravidian may have been spoken in the Indus civilization, suggesting a tentative date of Proto-Dravidian around the early part of the 3rd millennium. Remember, every time you see the word proto, it is designating carbon organic tribes, family, and clans being the first in time proto-history, the beginning, giving rise to parent substance of a specified substance or first formed meaning primary. Hence the use of the term primitive for carbon organic families, tribes, and clans. The origins of the Dravidians are a very complex subject of research and debate in Western academic circles. They are regarded as indigenous to the Indian subcontinent, but may have deeper pre-Neolithic roots from Western Asia, specifically from the Arabian Plateau or Persian Plateau spanning parts of West Asia, Central Asia, and South Asia. As a historical region, it includes Parthia, Media, Persis, all lands that begin with carbon organic origins. Their origins are often viewed as being connected with the Indus Valley Civilization, hence people and language spread east and southwards after the demise of the Indus Valley Civilization in the early 2nd millennium BCE. Some propose not long before the arrival of hybrid Asian albino Indo-Aryan speakers, with whom they intensively interacted, creating the same genetic admixtures between the original carbon organic inhabitants and the Yamnaya steppe ancestry invaders that occurred in Anatolia and the Peloponnese, as we will shortly show. Genetically, the ancient Indus Valley people were composed of a primarily carbon organic hunter-gatherers or farmers ancestry, with varying degrees of ancestry from local hunter-gatherer groups. The modern-day Dravidian speakers display a similar genetic makeup, but also carry a small portion of Western steppe herders' ancestry and may also have additional contributions from genetically admixed local hunter-gatherers groups. Mohenjo-Daro, Harappa, and other cities are located in modern Pakistan, which was a part of India until 1947. Egyptians, Sumerians, Mohenjo-Daroans, Harrappans, and Cretans, Elamites, and Nubians were literate over 4,000 years ago, before the world ever heard of Greeks or Romans, and there is ample evidence of their literacy. The first out of Africa migration, circa 60,000 BC, saw blacks with straight hair, taking a route along the coast of Asia, and then island hopping across the Indian Ocean to Australia, the Australian Aborigine, and then making their way to South America, the remains called Luzia in Brazil. Those wishing to pursue an understanding of the human journey and specifics of the ancient East African migrations, which led to modern man's colonization of the entire world, please visit the National Geographic Genographic Project, Atlas of the Human Journey. Though as one would expect, when it comes to European and Anatolian settlement, it is not only inaccurate, it is downright racist. But what would you expect? The second migration event, circa 50,000 BC, saw blacks from Africa, some with Mongol features, take an inland route through southern Asia and on up to China, where they settled. Included with this group were some straight-haired blacks without Mongol features, now called Dravidians, who stayed close to Africa and settled in India and other areas of southern Asia. Also included with this second group were albinos, who were probably motivated by a quest for relief from the heat and burning sunshine of southern Africa and relief from the torment heaped upon them by normal Africans. Even today, superstitious blacks of southern Africa maim and mutilate albinos in the ignorant belief that their body parts possess magical properties, which they use in rituals. These are authentic albinos of the original people of India, the Dravidians. Albinism is a form of hypopigmentary congenital disorder, characterized by a partial or total lack of melanin pigment in the eyes, skin, and hair. Albinism is hereditary. The principal gene, which results in albinism, prevents the body from making the usual amounts of the pigment melanin. Most forms of albinism are the result of the biological inheritance of genetically recessive alleles, genes, passed from both parents of an individual, though some rare forms are inherited from only one parent. But the main reason the albinos left Africa was the burning sunshine of southern Africa. Because organisms with albinism have skin that lacks, sufficiently or entirely, the dark pigment melanin, which helps protect the skin from ultraviolet radiation coming from the sun, they can sunburn easily from overexposure. Most of the more than 2 million cases of non-melanoma skin cancer diagnosed yearly in the United States are considered to be sun-related. Melanoma is a cancer that begins in the melanocytes, the cells that produce the skin coloring or pigment known as melanin. Melanin helps protect the deeper layers of the skin from the harmful effects of the sun. These hybrid Asian albinos continued on to Central Asia, where they settled. Of course, Dravidians are not the only black people who can produce European-type offspring. Any black couple with straightish-type hair and defective OCA2 genes will produce offspring that is identical to, and in fact is, a European-type offspring. Careful note should be made here that sometimes albinism causes straightening of the hair. Confirmation that the white, Caucasian, race is derived from Dravidian albinos is documented in the findings from genetic analysis of Y-DNA haplogroup R. In human genetics, haplogroup R is a Y chromosome DNA haplogroup, a subgroup of haplogroup P, defined by the M207 mutation. This haplogroup is believed to have arisen around 26,800 years ago, somewhere in Central Asia or South Asia. Cambridge University geneticist Kivisild et al., 2003, suggests that Southern and Western Asia might be the source of this haplogroup, which is restricted to India, Pakistan, Iran, and Southern Central Asia. It is possible that Southern and Western Asia were the source for R1 and R1A differentiation. The R haplogroup is common throughout Europe and Western Asia and the Indian subcontinent, and in those whose ancestry is from within these regions. It also occurs in North and Sub-Saharan Africa. Haplogroup R1A is typical in populations of Eastern Europe, Indian subcontinent, and parts of Central Asia. R1B can be found at low frequency in Central Asia, Middle East, South Asia, as well as North Africa. There is an isolated pocket of R1B in Sub-Saharan Africa. In Europe, R1B coincides with areas of what is falsely referred to as Celtic influence. Sometime around 6000 BC, a nomadic herding people, Dravidians, settled into villages in the mountainous region just west of the Indus River. There they grew barley and wheat, harvesting it using sickles with flint blades. They lived in small houses built with adobe bricks. After about 5000 BC, the climate in their region changed, bringing more rainfall, which apparently enabled them to grow more food, for they grew in population. They began domesticating sheep, goats, and cows, and then water buffalo. Then after 4000 BC, they began to trade with distant areas in Central Asia and areas west of the Khyber Pass. They also began using bronze and other metals. In time, the total area of the Indus civilization became larger than that of the Old Kingdom of Egypt. Their cities were characterized by buildings of elaborate architecture, constructed of fired brick, with sewage systems and paved streets. Typical of these large planned cities is Mohenjo-Daro, which along with its great buildings, had city streets laid out in a grid. The city is thought to have housed roughly 50,000 people and had a granary, baths, assembly halls, and towers. The city was divided into two parts. West of the city there stood a citadel surrounded by a wall. This citadel appears to have been a religious center. The citadel included an elaborate tank or bath, created with fine quality brickwork and sewer drains. A veranda then surrounded this area. Also located here were a giant granary, a large residential structure, and at least two aisled assembly halls. To the east of the citadel was the lower city, laid out in a grid pattern. The streets were straight and were drained to keep the area sanitary. Mohenjo-Daro had a building with an underground furnace and dressing rooms, suggesting bathing was done in heated pools, as in modern-day Hindu temples. The people of the city used very little stone in their construction. They preferred bricks, two types of bricks mainly, fired bricks, and wood bricks, which were created by using burnt wood ash. They used timber to create the flat roofs of their buildings. There are brick stairways leading to the roofs of many houses, suggesting that roofs were used as recreational areas, as in early Anatolia. Houses were of various sizes, some were small, and others were large with interior courtyards and indoor bathrooms. Several craftsman workshops have been found, such as metalworking, carpentry, and shell working. Defensively, Mohenjo-Daro was a well-fortified city. Though it did not have city walls, it did have towers to the west of the main settlement and defensive fortifications to the south. These fortifications, taken into consideration, as well as a comparison to the Harappa ruins to the northeast, lead to the conclusion that perhaps Mohenjo-Daro was an administrative center. Both Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro share relatively the same architectural layout. Harappa is less well preserved due to early site defilement and were generally not heavily fortified like other Indus Valley sites. The Indus people also utilized seals for signatures and pictorial presentation, as did the people to the northwest in Elam and Sumer. The Indus Valley people carried on active trade relations with the Middle East in gold, copper utensils, lapis lazuli, ivory, beads, and semi-precious stones. Sometime between 1800 and 1700 BC, civilization on the Indus Plain all but vanished. What befell these people is unknown. One suspected cause is a shift in the Indus River, another is a huge ruinous earthquake, still another is monumental flooding of the rivers. Flooding that would explain the thick layers of silt 30 feet above the level of the river at the site of Mohenjo-Daro. Of course, these are only unsubstantiated theories. No one knows what really caused the people to leave. Later, people of a different culture inhabited some of the abandoned cities in what archaeologists call a squatter period. Then the squatters also disappeared. Careful note should be made that only the people and culture of the valley vanished. The Indus Valley Civilization was the largest of its time and covered a vast territory. It effectively extended north to the Himalayas and east to what is now Vietnam. But because of the Aryan invasion or migration, whichever, subsequent Indus history was lost. Additionally, we should keep in mind that the hybrid Asian albinos were illiterate nomads. The Rig Veda was written 600 years after they had arrived, so whomever it was that kept civilization alive in India during the convulsive period, it couldn't have been them. Surviving remnants of the Indus Valley people in Southeast Asia will be dealt with later. Knowledge of the Mohenjo-Daro civilization died until archaeologists discovered evidence of the civilization in the 20th century. As to where these people went, no one knows for sure. Some believe that they went to southern India, some surely did. But one guess is that many of the Indus Valley people went to the north, into Elam and Sumer to rejoin their former group. This scenario would explain the somewhat sudden appearance of the Medes and Persians in Elam, as well as other, similar groups in eastern Anatolia. The Dravidians in ethnic type are Ethiopians, and are the original indigenous race of India, from which her civilization originated. Megathene said that the natives of India and Ethiopia were not much different in complexion or feature. Dravidians are short like the race of the Mediterraneans called Iberians and the Chaldeans. Their complexions are black or very dark. Their hair is plentiful and crispy. Their heads are elongated with the nose very broad. They occupy the oldest geological formations in India. They are the descendants of that race of black men with short woolly hair that were the primitive inhabitants of ancient Media, Susiana, and Persia, mentioned repeatedly in Iranian legends and whose faces look out at us from the sculptures on Babylon and Nineveh. In ancient times, India was ruled by rajas, who were assisted by a council of elders. Sometimes a queen mother or dowager influenced the rajas. In Kushite, race's lineage was traced through the mother. The succession of the Raja was traced in the same way. This was changed upon the ascendancy of the Brahmins. The spirit of the Kushite was to honor and exalt women, therefore lineage was traced via the female through knowledge and understanding of mitochondria DNA. Nephews when born of sisters were treated as sons and inherited the property to the exclusion of sons. Deval described the Queen of Eliza as a black Ethiopian. He said she ruled like a woman of judgment. Marco Polo described the inhabitants of India as black and adorned with massive gold bracelets and strings of rare and precious gems. They are temples and priests, and Vasco da Gama, whilst circumnavigating the globe, found the inhabitants as black. The ancient poets and writers often spoke of two nations, which were called Ethiopia. Homer says, Neptune was now visiting the Ethiopians, who reside at a great distance, those Ethiopians, who are divided into two nations, and are the most remote of mankind. One nation of them is towards the setting sun, the others far in the east, where the sun rises. The Encyclopedia Britannica confirms this. All the ancients, both poets and historians, talk of a double race of Ethiopians, one in India and another in Africa. The kingdoms of the Indians, the Egyptians, and ancient Kush were widely regarded as part of one large global empire, and India, taken as a whole, beginning from the north and embracing what of it is subject to Persia, is a continuation of Egypt and the Ethiopians. The earliest Ethiopian tradition says that they came from a land situated near the mouth of the Indus, and this has been confirmed by the testimony of Eusebius and Philostratus. Eusebius informs us that a numerous colony of people emigrated from the banks of the Indus and, crossing the ocean, fixed their residence in the country now called Ethiopia. These earliest Ethiopians were a people highly civilized and full of virtue and piety. Their laws, their institutions, and especially their religions were celebrated far and wide. Apollonius of Tyana, a charismatic philosopher from the 1st century CE, had traveled extensively throughout the world and held discussions with a large number of philosophers. In a conference with the southern Ethiopians, finding that they spoke much in praise of the Indians in general, Apollonius told them, "You speak much in favor of everything relating to the Indians, not considering that originally you were Indians yourself." Nilus the Egyptian had told Apollonius that the India of all people in the world were the most knowing, and that the Ethiopians were a colony from them and resembled them greatly. It is for this reason that the ancient writers also called the Ethiopians Indi. Jacob Bryant writes in an analysis of ancient mythology, 1776, that Alien, in describing the Libyans of interior Africa, says that they bordered upon the Indi, by which were meant the Ethiopians. Pages 216 to 17, he further writes that the Africans, who had the management of elephants in war, were called Indi, as being of Ethiopic origin. Polybius says in The Passing of the Rhone, it happened that Hannibal lost all the Indi, but the elephants were preserved. Pages 213 to 14. New research using ancient DNA is rewriting prehistory in India and shows that its civilization is the result of multiple ancient migrations. Hindu right-wingers believe the source of Indian civilization are people who called themselves Aryans, a nomadic tribe of horse-riding, cattle-rearing warriors and herders who composed Hinduism's oldest religious texts, the Vedas. The Aryans, they argue, originated from India and then spread across large parts of Asia and Europe, helping set up the family of Indo-European languages that Europeans and Indians still speak today. As it happens, many 19th century European ethnographers and, of course, most famously, Adolf Hitler, also considered Aryans the master race who had conquered Europe, although the German leader considered them to be of Nordic lineage. Many Indian scholars have questioned the Out of India thesis, arguing that these Indo-European language speakers, or Aryans, were possibly just one of many streams of prehistoric migrants who arrived in India after the decline of an earlier civilization. This was the Harrapan, or Indus Valley, civilization, which thrived in what is now northwestern India and Pakistan around the same time as the Egyptians and Mesopotamians. However, Hindu right-wingers believe the Harrapan civilization was also an Aryan or Vedic civilization. Studies using ancient DNA have been rewriting prehistory all over the world in the last few years, and in India, there has been one fascinating discovery after another. The most recent study on this subject, led by geneticist David Reich of Harvard University, was published in March 2018 and co-authored by 92 scholars from all over the world, many of them leading names in disciplines as diverse as genetics, history, archaeology, and anthropology. 5,000 years ago, there was no branch of the hybrid Asian albinos race that could have produced the Rig Veda. 5,000 years ago, no so-called biblical Japhetic nation possessed blacksmiths, chariots, and the civilization that the Rig Veda reveals. It seems to be the story of the passage to the southwest of the carbon organic Hindu colonies from the mountains of Hindu Kush down into the plains of India. Note the name of the region from which they came. In the beginning, these settlers took to Dravidian wives, because most probably they were primarily of the same stock. 3000 to 4500 BC, the father is represented with all the Kushite traits in all their glory. He was a priest of the family, there was no burning of widows, and women enjoyed a high position. The Rig Veda represents these people at this far distant age as blacksmiths, barbers, coppersmiths, goldsmiths, carpenters, and husbandmen. They fought from chariots, as did all Kushite nations. They settled down as husbandmen to till the fields. Unlike the modern Hindu, they ate beef. They adored gods identical with those of Egypt, Chaldea, and Ethiopia. Who were these people who in 4500 BC possessed towns and built ships? The early invaders found in the Vedas describe these people in possession of wealth, having cattle, cities, and forts. The literature represents them as making alliances with the native Kushite princes. This would have been impossible if they had not been of the same race. The Nubian Kushites of old Ethiopia will not intermarry with genetically mixed Arabs or the genetically mixed Egyptians. To those who read the Rig Veda intelligently and without the confusing glasses of prejudice, these mutilated and interpolated writings are but a description of the familiar traits and customs of Kushite Ethiopians. The Brahmins were a much later and intermixed branch of the inhabitants of the Hindu Kush. The fact that the Brahmins altered the Sanskrit writings to such great extent is proof itself that they were not the original authors and these were not their original works. They took over and appropriated much of carbon organic Buddhism that would appeal to the masses when these hybrids found it otherwise impossible for them to sit in the saddle of priesthood, much like would be done with the later carbon organic cultures. That became the Western religions that are today controlled by hybrid Asian albinos and their fake usurped versions of Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. These Dravidians that the Rig Veda of the Brahmins book seeks to represent today as despised outcasts when they are still a very important division of the Hindu population, entered India in primitive times via the Northwest Passage. They were a part of that advancing wave of the old race that swept eastward and westward, peopling Arabia, Egypt, and Chaldea. This ancestry is that of indigenous populations associated with the carbon organic native hunter-gatherers of the region who covered a vast area of Central Asia before the incoming stepherder hybrid Asian albino invasion from the north. Importantly, in the 3rd millennium BCE, we do not find any individuals with ancestry derived from Yamnaya-related steppe pastoralists. Indus Valley, 1200 to 800 BCE, thus, the hybrid Asian albino steppe ancestry was not yet widespread across the region. Between 2100 to 1700 BCE, we observe steppe ancestry in the admixed form typically carried by the later Middle to Late Bronze Age steppe groups. This documents the southward movement of steppe ancestry through this region that only began to have a major impact around the turn of the 2nd millennium BCE. Notably, as we have covered in the previous webisodes, this was exactly what was happening in the Balkans, Anatolia, and the Peloponnese regions. While ancient DNA studies have documented westward movements of peoples from the steppe that plausibly spread this ancestry, our documentation of a large-scale genetic pressure from steppe herder groups in the 2nd millennium BCE provides a prime candidate, a finding that is consistent with archaeological evidence of connections between material culture in the Kazakh Middle to Late Bronze Age steppe and early Vedic culture in India. Our analysis also provides an entirely new line of evidence for a linkage between steppe ancestry and Indo-European culture. We found the strongest 2 signals in Brahman Tiwari and Brahman_up. Although the enrichment for steppe ancestry is not found in the southern Indian groups, the steppe enrichment in the northern groups is striking, as Brahmins and Bhumihars are among the traditional custodians of texts written in early Sanskrit. A possible explanation is that the influx of steppe ancestry into South Asia in the mid-2nd millennium BCE created a metapopulation of groups with different proportions of steppe ancestry, with ones having relatively more steppe ancestry having a central role in spreading early Vedic culture. We finally highlight a remarkable parallel between the prehistory of 2 subcontinents of Eurasia, South Asia, and Europe. In both regions, West Asian agricultural technology spread from an origin in the Near East in the 7th and 6th millennia BCE. In both Europe and South Asia, populations related to the Yamnaya steppe pastoralists arrived after this agriculturalist and hunter-gatherer admixture took place, interacting with local populations to produce mixed groups, which then mixed further with already resident agriculturalist populations to produce genetic groupings such as those found associated with much of Europe. We hope you have enjoyed this webisode, have a clear clarification of the Kushites who migrated into the Indus River Valley region as the progenitors of the Indian subcontinent. The actual full narrative of the region we will discuss in future webisodes, but it is enough to suffice that the Kushites were established the entire Fertile Crescent region. In the next webisode, we will address the issue of the term Aryan, as the misconception of the word has fueled racist ideologies which have influenced the real history of this planet, and we will connect the term with the Brahmins, which we have just slightly mentioned in this webisode, as the Brahmins are often conflated with the biblical Abraham, the patriarch of the Hebrew religion. Join us on the next episode as we continue to unravel the mysteries of our past to create a better blueprint for the future for all fallen humanity. This series, The Claim of Thrones, will take you on a journey through the universe, across the galactic heavens to the eventual seeding of the planet Earth. This series will also cover the hidden realities of how humanity came about, the various cataclysms and restarts, and follow the various bloodlines of indigenous rights of inheritance. This narrative sets the sacred record straight in regards to who's who on the planet Earth and begins the journey of the lawful reversion and restitution for the heirs of Mother Earth. If you like this content, please subscribe and hit the notification button, as well as support across our many social media platforms.